Maya Angelou spent her life giving voice to the African American experience, yet the specific African origins of her own bloodline were unknown to her. The DNA results that finally surfaced traced her maternal line not to a generalized African past, but to a specific people, a specific place, and a cultural tradition so aligned with her life's work that the connection seemed almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. She was born Marguerite Annie Johnson on April 4th, 1928 in St. Louis, Missouri, the second child of Bailey Johnson Sr. and Vivian Baxter. Within 3 years, her parents' marriage had collapsed, and she and her brother Bailey were sent by train to Stamps, Arkansas, to live with their paternal grandmother, Annie Henderson. She was 3 years old. The journey was not a visit. It was the beginning of a life defined by displacement. Stamps in the 1930s was a town built on racial hierarchy so rigid it functioned like architecture. Black residents understood where they could walk, where they could not, what they could say, and what silence was required of them. Annie Henderson ran a small general store and raised her grandchildren with discipline, faith, and an unspoken understanding of how survival worked in the American South. It was here that Marguerite Johnson began to learn what it meant to carry an identity that the surrounding world worked constantly to diminish. At 8 years old, she was raped by her mother's boyfriend. When she disclosed the assault, the man was killed, likely by her uncles. Believing her words had caused his death, she stopped speaking almost entirely. For nearly 5 years, she was effectively mute. In that silence, she read. She memorized poetry, absorbed novels, and built an interior world out of language at the precise moment the exterior world had made speaking feel like a weapon she could not safely hold. When her voice returned, it came back transformed. What emerged from that silence was not simply a girl who had learned to speak again. It was the beginning of the woman who would eventually write that she knew why the caged bird sings. Yet for all the eloquence she would later command, one question remained beyond her reach. She could trace her grandmother's strength, her mother's complicated brilliance, the community of Stamps, and the long shadow of Southern segregation. What she could not trace was where any of them had originally come from. The African side of her ancestry, like that of most African Americans, had been swallowed by a history that kept no records for the people it considered property. The erasure was not accidental, it was policy. Under American slavery, enslaved people were legally classified as property. Property does not have a birthplace, a mother, or a people. It has an owner. That legal reality produced a documentary record that was thorough in recording transactions and silent on everything else: sales, transfers, estate inventories. These documents exist in abundance. The names of African ethnic groups, the villages people came from, and the languages they spoke before they were silenced were never written down because they were never considered worth recording. The result was a genealogical structure unlike almost any other in American history. Most families, given enough time and resources, can follow their line back through census records, church registers, immigration files, and land deeds. African American families can follow that same path until they reach what genealogists call the brick wall. For most, that wall appears somewhere in the decades before the Civil War. Behind it, the records do not thin out gradually. They stop entirely. The 1870 United States Census was the first to record formerly enslaved people by name. Before that, they appeared in the census only as numbers beneath a slaveholder's entry, age, sex, and a mark indicating race. No names, no family relationships, no place of origin. A woman who had survived the Middle Passage, raised children, buried parents, and built a life across decades of bondage could vanish from the historical record entirely, leaving nothing but a number on a page that did not even belong to her. The Freedmen's Bureau, established after the Civil War, attempted to document formerly enslaved people and reunite separated families. Its records are invaluable and deeply incomplete. Many families were never registered. Many registrations were lost. The Bureau existed for 7 years before Congress shut it down, leaving an enormous portion of the Reconstruction-era African-American population without even that partial documentation. For Maya Angelou's family, as for millions of others, the trail followed this same pattern. Records, then silence, names, then numbers, and then nothing at all. The documentary history of her African ancestry did not fade. It was cut off at a specific moment in time by a system that had always intended it that way. The science arrived before most people understood what it could do. In the late 1990s, a small number of geneticists and genealogists began exploring whether DNA sequencing could accomplish what documents could not. If the paper trail ended at the brick wall, could the genetic code carry the story further back? Could a biological signature, passed unchanged through generations of women, reach across the Middle Passage and identify not just a continent, but a people? The tool they focused on was mitochondrial DNA. Unlike the genetic material that recombines with each new generation, mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child essentially unaltered. A woman carries the same mitochondrial signature as her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and every maternal ancestor before her, stretching back thousands of years. If a large enough reference database existed, matching a living person's mitochondrial signature against known African populations could, in theory, identify the specific ethnic group from which their direct maternal line descended. The company African Ancestry, founded in 2003 by geneticist Rick Kittles and entrepreneur Gina Payne, built its business on exactly this premise. It assembled one of the largest databases of African genetic lineages ever compiled, covering more than 30 countries and hundreds of ethnic groups. For African Americans specifically, the emotional stakes of this technology were unlike anything the consumer genetics industry had previously encountered. For people whose ancestral paper trail had been deliberately destroyed, a DNA result was something closer to the recovery of a stolen identity. The technology was not without limitations. Mitochondrial DNA traces only one line, the direct maternal chain. It says nothing about the dozens of other ancestral lines that converge in any individual. Critics within the genetic science community cautioned against overinterpreting single lineage results, warning that ethnic matching involved population probabilities rather than certainties. Those cautions were legitimate. They were also, for many people waiting on results, beside the point. When Henry Louis Gates Jr. brought this technology to a national audience through the 2006 PBS documentary series African American Lives, one of the subjects sitting across from him was Maya Angelou. The test had been taken. The results were waiting. The documentary team began where every genealogical investigation begins, with paper. Angelou's maternal line was the primary focus. Her mother, Vivian Baxter, was a known figure, vivid, complicated, and well documented in Angelou's own writing. Her maternal grandmother, Annie Henderson, the woman Angelou called Mama, was the gravitational center of her childhood in stamps. Henderson was born in 1880 in Arkansas, a woman who had built a life with formidable discipline in a state that offered black women almost nothing by way of legal protection or social standing. The researchers pushed further back. Behind Henderson, the records became thinner. Each generation retreated further from the reach of reliable documentation. Names appeared and then grew uncertain. Census entries became harder to match. The further back the team reached, the more the trail exhibited the same pattern that defined African American genealogy across the South: partial records, broken chains, and then, at a specific point in the antebellum period, silence. The brick wall arrived on schedule. Somewhere in the middle decades of the 19th century, Angelou's maternal ancestry disappeared into the anonymity of slavery. The women who had carried her direct maternal line through those decades were not missing from history because they had lived unremarkable lives. They were missing because the system they lived under had no interest in preserving evidence of their existence beyond their value as property. The mitochondrial DNA test was designed precisely for this moment. The genetic signature those women had passed from mother to daughter, unchanged through every generation, was still present in Angelou's cells. It had survived the Middle Passage, survived slavery, survived Reconstruction, survived Jim Crow, and arrived intact in a laboratory in the 21st century. The documents had been destroyed, the DNA had not. The sample was collected, sequenced, and run against the African Ancestry database. The mitochondrial signature was isolated and compared against hundreds of ethnic group profiles spanning the African continent. The search was not for a continent or a region, it was for a specific people. And the database, for the first time in the history of Angelou's family, had an answer. The result pointed to Sierra Leone. More specifically, it pointed to the Menda people, one of the two largest ethnic groups in the country, with a population and cultural presence stretching back centuries across the forested interior of what is now Sierra Leone and parts of Liberia. The match was not a broad regional approximation. It was a specific ethnic identification drawn from a database built on the genetic signatures of living Mende descendants. The Mende were not a peripheral people. They had a complex social structure, a rich oral tradition, and a set of cultural institutions that placed particular weight on the authority of women. The most significant of these was the Sande Society, a female institution with no precise equivalent anywhere else in West Africa. The Sande Society governed female initiation, education, and the transmission of cultural knowledge across generations. It controlled access to certain forms of spiritual and civic life. In a region and an era when women's formal authority was rare, the Mende had built an entire institutional structure around it. The parallel was not subtle. A woman who had rebuilt herself from silence and made her voice one of the most recognized in 20th century American literature descended from a culture that had organized itself for centuries around the preservation and transmission of women's voices and women's wisdom. The DNA had not just identified an ethnic group. It had drawn a line between a cultural tradition and the woman who, an ocean and several centuries removed, had lived out its values without ever knowing they had a name. Sierra Leone's position in the history of the Atlantic slave trade made the result historically coherent as well. The region had been one of the most heavily targeted sources of enslaved people throughout the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. Mende communities were raided repeatedly. Men, women, and children were taken to the coast, loaded onto ships, and transported primarily to the American South and the Caribbean. The ancestors who carried Angelou's maternal line almost certainly made that crossing under conditions that no document fully captures and no living person can entirely imagine. The result answered the question the documents could not, but it also opened a door onto a history larger than any single family story. In 1839, a Portuguese slave ship called the Amistad left Havana carrying 53 captive Africans. 2 days into the coastal voyage, a man named Sengbe Pie led an uprising. The captives seized the ship, killed the captain and cook, and ordered the surviving crew to sail them back to Africa. The crew sailed east by day and north by night. The Amistad was intercepted off the coast of Long Island by the United States Navy. What followed was one of the most consequential legal battles in American history before the Civil War. The captives were imprisoned in New Haven, Connecticut, while abolitionists, legal scholars, and the Van Buren administration fought over their fate. Former President John Quincy Adams argued their case before the Supreme Court. In 1841, the court ruled in their favor. 35 of the surviving captives were returned to Sierra Leone. The majority of those captives were Mende. Their names were recorded. Their ethnic identity was documented. Their testimony was translated and preserved. In a legal system that routinely reduced African people to property with no name and no origin, the Amistad captives became one of the rare exceptions. Africans whose identity was formally acknowledged by the very courts that had spent decades looking away. The significance for Angelou's story was not direct lineage. There is no documented connection between her specific ancestors and the Amistad captives. The significance was historical proximity. The Mende communities that produced those captives were the same communities being raided throughout the same period. While Sangba PA and 34 others were eventually returned home, thousands of other Mende men, women, and children taken during the same decades were not. They remained in the American South, unnamed in the legal record, their origins swallowed by the same system that had briefly, under the pressure of an extraordinary legal case, acknowledged the humanity of their neighbors. Angelou's ancestors were almost certainly among those who did not get to go back. The DNA placed her maternal line inside the same community, the same historical moment, and the same catastrophic dispersal. The Amistad case gave that community a documented face. The DNA gave Angelou's family their place within it. Angelou received the results on camera. Her response was not shock. It was recognition. She described the feeling not as learning something new, but as having something confirmed that she had carried without proof for most of her life. The word she returned to was home, not a destination she had reached, but an origin she had always sensed and could now, for the first time, name. The response made sense against the arc of her life. In 1962, Angelou moved to Ghana, joining a community of African-American expatriates who had settled in Accra under the government of Kwame Nkrumah. She stayed for several years, working as a journalist and administrator, moving through a world that felt, by her own account, simultaneously familiar and just beyond full reach. She spoke of Africa as a place she recognized but could not entirely claim, a homeland whose specific address she did not know. The Ghana years deepened her identification with African cultural identity without resolving the question of where precisely she belonged within it. The Sierra Leone result gave that question an answer. Not Ghana, but a few hundred miles along the same coastline. Not a generalized African identity, but a specific one rooted in a people with a documented history, a living culture, and institutional traditions that resonated directly with the values she had built her life around. She had spent decades writing about the power of women's voices, the preservation of memory through storytelling, and the transmission of wisdom across generations under conditions designed to destroy it. The Mende Sande Society had been doing exactly that for centuries before her birth. They had encoded that cultural imperative into social structure. The parallel was not something she had engineered. It was something the DNA revealed. Beyond the maternal line, broader genetic analysis indicated that Angelou's ancestry also included heritage, consistent with multiple regions of Africa, reflecting the complex and often violent mixing of populations that defined the African-American experience over several centuries. One thread of that complexity pointed in a direction that no result could fully illuminate, and that the historical record had never been designed to preserve. The broader genetic analysis told a story that was, by the standards of African-American ancestry, entirely expected and historically unsurprising. A significant portion of Angelou's DNA reflected European ancestry. The percentage was consistent with patterns documented across the African-American population as a whole, where centuries of slavery produced a demographic reality that the historical record was deliberately structured to conceal. The origin of that European ancestry was not recorded anywhere. It never had been. The relationships that produced it were not relationships in any meaningful legal or social sense recognized by the period. They were the product of a system in which enslaved women had no legal standing to refuse, no recourse after the fact, and no mechanism by which what was done to them could be formally acknowledged. The men responsible left no confessions. The courts kept no records. The children born from those encounters were classified as enslaved, assigned their mother's status, and absorbed into a population that the law had already decided did not require documentation. The DNA reveals the fact of this history without recovering its details. It confirms that European ancestry entered Angelou's line at some point during the centuries of American slavery. It cannot name the men. It cannot identify the specific moment or the specific woman to whom it first happened. It offers a percentage where history owes a full account and a statistical pattern where individual lives should be. This is the limit that science reaches in cases like Angelou's. It is the same limit encountered in Lincoln's story, where DNA confirmed the maternal line with precision while leaving the identity of the unnamed Virginia planter permanently sealed. The tool is powerful enough to cross the brick wall. It is not powerful enough to recover what was buried on the other side with deliberate intent. What the DNA did recover was the stronger truth. Angelou's maternal line ran from the Mende people of Sierra Leone, through the Middle Passage, through the nameless generations of the antebellum South, through Annie Henderson's store in Stamps, Arkansas, and into the woman who sat down and wrote about all of it without knowing where any of it had actually begun. The DNA confirmed what Angelou had always written toward without being able to prove. Her maternal line belonged to the Mende of Sierra Leone, a people who built institutions around the authority of women's voices long before she added hers to the record. The European ancestry in her genome remains what it has always been, evidence of a history that was never meant to be examined. What science recovered was the origin. What it could not recover was the full human cost of the journey between that origin and the woman she became.